Lies of P is a good game. I'd even go as far as to say that it's a great game. It has its issues, of course, which I will get into later, but I will say that it's likely the best Souls-like I've had the pleasure of experiencing. That doesn't exactly appear to be a high bar for many people, I'm talking strictly about non-FromSoft games, but I had close to no anticipation for this title. I didn't expect this game to be bad or anything, I was just almost taken aback by the general quality of this game. This is kinda nuts for a game from a developer I've actually never heard of before in my life. I have heard of DJ Max though. That is basically the only thing I know they've made. Anyway, what makes Lies of P worth playing? I really don't need to say it, but this Real Boy Simulator is a game that wears its inspirations on its sleeve. Don't worry, I'm not gonna name drop the thing. No, not that thing. You know the thing. We all know the thing. But I am gonna name drop Nier, because there is some Nier-ass shit in this game. However, I won't go into spoilers yet, I will let you know when that happens. For now, let's go over the tutorial area of the game, because you can begin to notice what the game does well and doesn't do as well here. So, we wake up as our main boy, and off the bat, the game restricts our movement speed. It doesn't really matter that much at all, but force walking segments are one of my biggest pet peeves in game design. Anyways, besides that one gripe, you select your initial playstyle and the game throws you right into the action. It becomes immediately apparent that everything has gone wrong and the city of Winnipeg has become an absolute shithole. Sorry, did I say Winnipeg? I meant Krat. The first opponent we encounter has a very delayed attack animation. Take note of this because this is somewhat of a sign of things to come. However, this doesn't really matter as of yet because you can simply tell them to fuck off and leave us alone before they have a chance to attack. This goes for most of the enemies you'll encounter throughout the tutorial area, which makes sense. But then, you'll eventually meet your first elite enemy. Now, if you haven't found the shortcut by now, you should have. This is where the game teaches you about its general level design, which I would say is about Dark Souls 3 tier, for better or for worse. There's a decent chance you will lose this fight at least once, but that's pretty much only because you actually have to pay attention to the opponent's animations this time. That's why it's really good to have that shortcut handy, because things will likely get annoying if you haven't found it. After we beat the first enemy to present any challenge, we obtain a key that allows us to finally leave the station. This is technically where the game's tutorial ends, but that's not quite accurate. This is still very much the introductory portion of the game. However, now we get to experience Krat in its full, twisted beauty. While the city has gone to shit, you can tell that this catastrophe is recent. Krat's streets remain mostly intact, and it isn't too hard to imagine what this place would look like when you could go to the local sex doll shop without the fear of absolutely getting your shit kicked in by a puppet. However, we do hear an announcement that claims Krat is totally safe, trust me bro.
There is no cause for alarm. Do not panic, whatever you may hear. The city is safe to traverse. We repeat, do not be alarmed, citizens of Krat.
Yeah, I'm sure anyone who followed your authority is completely safe and thankful for your guidance. That being said, this is a really good tone setter, and this is where the game really started to hook me in with its atmosphere. It was at about this point that I could tell Lies of P was not your average Souls-like. Anyway, shortly after that message, we encounter our first opponent with one of these attacks. Now, you don't have any iframes when one of these glowing attacks is active, so you have three options with these attacks. You can parry them, get the fuck away from them as soon as possible, or you can take them like a champ. I didn't say they'd all be good options. Throughout the game, I often found myself simply opting to get away from these attacks because many of them have long startup animations, making it a bit more risky to find the right timing to parry them. You'll often find yourself using all your defensive options in this game, as individually they aren't really optimal for every situation. That is something you should learn pretty early on in this game if you don't want to have a completely miserable time with it. Moving on, we meet the first actual boss of the game, Parade Master. Now, I don't really have much to say about him other than the fact that he's a solid introductory boss. There are many opportunities to deal damage, and as long as you aren't playing in an overly stupid manner and remember all the mechanics you just learned, it should only take a few tries at most to beat this thing. In conclusion, I'd say he's just a little bit more difficult than the helicopter boss from Armored Core 6, which I guess marks this as this game's first great filter. So yeah, it's a pretty fun fight. After we beat Parade Master, we're faced with our first choice between telling the truth or a lie. The option is somewhat fake here, as you have to lie to progress. As soon as we enter, we're treated to the game's opening credits, which does a good job of establishing Krat's basic history without any dialogue. Overall, this is a pretty solid introduction to the game. The only problem is that the delayed attack animations on many enemies make it so you don't really have to respect them. This won't be the case later on, and it certainly isn't the case when you reach the Parade Master, so it can be easy to neglect your defensive options at first, making them a bit more difficult to get used to later on. I think being able to learn about your defensive options early on is important in this game because I believe it's one of the bigger hurdles that will hold some people back. At first, it can feel like the game's combat is simply a combination of various mechanics found in From Software games, and that's sort of the case, but it does end up feeling like something unique. I actually think the core combat mechanics are really solid for the most part. The variety of defensive and offensive options you have make the game feel a bit more dynamic to play, which I greatly appreciate. Sure, the parry window can feel really tight, almost a bit too tight, but the reality is that it exposes another flaw with the game's combat, and that's the animations. Now, don't get me wrong, the animations in this game are overall very good. Attacks generally have a satisfying sense of weight and impact. However, I think the reason why people complain about this game's parry a whole bunch is actually because of the animations. There are far too many delayed attacks from enemies where it isn't quite clear when you're supposed to react. Startups can be so slow and the active phase of the attacks can be so fast that reacting to some of these attacks with your eyesight alone isn't really sufficient. You will need to develop some pretty precise muscle memory. It can really feel like a gamble sometimes. However, there are some tricks you can utilize to make these animations a bit more manageable. If you're not sure when to react to an animation, it's always best to hit the block button early and commit to it. This way you at least have a chance to regain any health that has been lost. If you get hit directly, it's going to hurt. This game can harshly punish you for not utilizing your defensive options correctly. Additionally, some blades are better at tanking damage upon block than others, so I generally recommend using something that can block effectively on your first playthrough. Keep in mind that even if you manage to block an attack the first time, you're not going to be able to get your health back if you get directly hit by another one. Lies of P is a very challenging game. I'd even go as far as to say that it's the most difficult game I've played this year. I'll admit that most of the time I spent with this game was before the first patch, but as someone who beat the game pre-patch, I can definitely understand why they'd make some balancing changes to this game. For example, capacity is a stat that might not seem vital to every build, but it's way more important than you might imagine. If you weren't dumping points into capacity, good luck with using some of the game's later equipment. Even then, some boss amulets were insanely heavy for no real good reason in my opinion. For most of the game, I only had a single weapon equipped so I could keep my build's weight at a manageable level. Fortunately, these capacity issues did get addressed with the game's first patch, and I'm glad. Because if you allocate your points in a way that you dislike, you're going to be waiting quite a while until you're able to respec. So I recommend caution when spending ergo. It's not necessarily the best idea to min-max on your first playthrough, especially since you'll be leveling up at a much noticeably slower rate as the game goes on. However, there are 3 stats of which you may want to choose only one of. Motivity, Technique, and Advance are the 3 stats that weapons will scale with. Basically, Motivity is Strength, Technique is Dexterity, and Advance is Elemental Damage. Generally speaking, these stats behave as you might expect. Motivity weapons tend to pack a big punch but are slow, technique weapons are weaker but have several more opportunities to attack, and Advance is basically the game's easy mode. Seriously, I went for a dex build in my first playthrough and nearly rage quit several times. However, sometime after I beat the game, I started a fresh playthrough to record some gameplay footage and was astonished by how the electric coil stick absolutely melted content I remembered struggling with. I think the reason why this game is more difficult than most Souls-likes is because it's generally harder to cheese fights in this game with broken tactics. That's not to say that there isn't any cheese, but the game typically wants you fighting things up close and personal. Even when utilizing some of the more powerful weapons in the game, you will need to respect the movesets of bosses and elite enemies. While this does limit the build variety in a way, there are enough different weapons and progression systems in this game that make it easy to replay and fun to experiment with. My favorite weapon in this game only becomes available much later and by itself gives a huge incentive to experience New Game Plus. In addition, the awfully named P Orkin skill tree is definitely not going to be completed on your first playthrough. This is one of those games you will want to hop right back into when you beat it. The only reason I haven't played more of this game is because I've been a pretty busy guy. Anyways, if my talk about difficulty and whatnot scares you off from this game, fear not. The developers realized that maybe their game was almost a bit too difficult, and the first patch has made the game far more accessible to those who might want a bit more of a casual experience. For example, Spectres actually work now. Before the patch, Spectres were pretty fucking useless for the most part, but now they basically serve their intended function. I think that's a good change. One change I'm a bit more iffy on is the health reduction on bosses. This really wasn't an issue for me. I thought the boss fights were at perfect length before. There's perhaps a few too many bosses with 2 health bar phases for my liking, but I never describe any of the bosses as huge damage sponges. So yeah, the game that is out now is definitely easier than the one I initially played. That doesn't mean it's a walk in the park, but you can now experience the game with considerably less frustration if you want to. One thing I can't believe I haven't discussed yet is the general polish of this game. Lies of P is easily one of the best PC releases I've played in recent memory. It's a shame about the whole de nouveau thing, but otherwise this port is nearly flawless. It's sad I have to praise this, but it really feels like a properly finished game. I can run Lies of P at max settings with outstanding performance on a 3070, and it's still a great experience at around 50 frames per second on Steam Deck at low settings. And yeah, it's not like the game is the most graphically advanced out there by any means, but it still looks great and feels smooth as butter to play. They kinda outdid themselves here, if I'm being honest. Far more games should be launching with this level of polish. You know, I haven't said that much about the soundtrack, and that's not because it's bad. It does its job at creating the atmosphere it needs to, but it's the kind of soundtrack that doesn't always stick out to you, which can be a good thing. That being said, there are a few standout tracks, but I also heard that the records you pick up are redone DJ Max tracks. But damn, do I love putting on feel when visiting Hotel Krat. So at this point, I'm likely going to get into more spoiler-heavy territory. I'm going to be discussing some of the later bosses, environments, and a bit of the story going forward. If you want to experience this game with a mostly fresh set of eyes, this is your chance to click off the video. Don't say I didn't warn you. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about this game's environmental and level design. While areas are generally not overly complex in their layouts, they're very consistent in quality for the most part. It's still a joy to find rare items, find a shortcut back to the beginning of the level, and just soak in the atmosphere. That's one of my favorite aspects of this game. Most areas manage to establish a thick, moody tone while remaining fairly distinct. I felt compelled to push myself through boss encounters just to see what the next area would be. I always know a game is good when I'm constantly looking forward to finding out what lies ahead. My favorite area in the game is likely Rosa Isabel Street. It's the perfect example of how good this game's environmental design can be. At first, it can feel like the streets you have seen before, and that's not exactly a surprise since it's an area very close to Hotel Krat. However, as you traverse, you begin to notice how exceptionally beautiful this area is. Through the environment alone, you can tell that this was once an entertainment district, home to plenty of grand shows. Landmarks such as the amphitheater show how extravagant this location is. It illustrates just how wealthy Krat was before it went to shit. This beauty is also juxtaposed by the sewers that lie right underneath, giving Rosa Isabel Street some literal depth. Also, the final stretch before reaching the Opera House is especially gorgeous as well, setting a tense mood with both overcasting and fire as a creepy clown mini-boss guards what lies beyond it. However, there is one flaw here, as it's pretty easy to pick up on the repetition of environmental assets here. However, the fact that this doesn't bother me more despite how blatant it is just goes to show how strong the art direction is here. Once you reach the Opera House, it becomes immediately apparent that it's the jewel of the district. It's not exactly as labyrinthian as you might expect, but that also makes it feel like a location that could realistically exist. A lot of care has been put into how this place has been rendered. It's a building perfectly suited for the King of Puppets. Lies of P is full of places that feature this sort of environmental narrative. Levels are paced in a very meticulous way that evokes particular emotions while exploring them. It's rare for a level to feel the same way as it began. It's somewhat like how David Lynch is very good at making you feel the emotions he wants you to experience while watching one of his films. You might not completely understand what's going on, but the emotions you feel might give you a clue. Unfortunately, while the majority of these locations are great, the game's final areas didn't hold up as well for me. The last area in particular definitely overstayed its welcome, and to make matters worse, it's one of the blandest looking locations in the game as well. It suffers from what I would call final level syndrome. It's just too long and doesn't manage to evolve into anything particularly interesting. Fortunately, there are a couple of memorable bosses here to somewhat make up for it, but there is one that is less enjoyable, which I will get to in a bit. Overall, however, I really enjoyed the environments in Lies of P. I think the game's world is one of its greatest strengths and what sets it apart from so many Souls-likes. This Belle Epoque steampunk setting is so well realized and I just want to see more of it. I am looking forward to whatever DLC they have planned for this game and the potential sequel that might have been teased at the end with none other than Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. Next, I want to talk about the game's bosses. Overall, I quite like them. That's not to say they're perfect, but I believe that most of them are fun fights despite being really challenging sometimes, and that's a careful balance to strike. It's easy to make boss battles difficult in ways that aren't particularly fun. Just look at Sonic Frontiers: The Final Horizon, for example. Now, spoiler alert for anyone who cares, but this DLC eventually requires the player to time their parries when they reach a certain boss rush. I don't necessarily mind this, as one of my biggest complaints about the combat in Sonic Frontiers is that it's far too easy most of the time, and a few tweaks can make it more engaging. However, when you're playing on hard mode, Parries have a very precise reaction window during the boss rush and the final boss. The titans you face in the boss rush aren't really designed around this tight parry window, so some attack animations are a crapshoot when it comes to reacting. To make matters worse, you're limited to 400 rings that you must use across the entire boss rush. This makes for something of a frustrating and unfun challenge. I don't blame anyone for turning down the difficulty to easy here. The issues don't end there, as the final boss has an assortment of its own problems. The attack animations are better telegraphed for the perfect parry, but unfortunately, the game is misleading about how much this matters. The real challenge of this fight is figuring out what the fuck to actually do, and it isn't particularly fun. It's fairly easy once you figure it out, but the game does a pretty piss-poor job of hinting at how to execute the solution. But now I'm going off on an unrelated tangent. This is a Lies of P review. A full Sonic Frontiers review can wait for another time. Anyways, while the Lies of P bosses share some of the telegraphing issues that Sonic Frontiers has during that boss rush, it isn't as big of an issue here. The reason for that being is the game gives you several options to deal with awkwardly telegraphed animations. If you can't reliably parry an attack, you can either dodge or just simply block and take some chip damage. This is what keeps these animation issues from becoming a bigger problem. It might even be intentional to a degree. So yeah, while bosses have the tendency to absolutely kick your ass in this game, they are still quite fun for the most part. Once you study a moveset enough, a lot of fights have a great sense of back and forth. It also helps that most of the boss designs in this game are cool as fuck. Some of my favorite fights include the King of Puppets, Laxasia the Complete, and the Nameless Puppet. I think they strike a nice balance between spectacle, challenge, and functionality. These fights also work pretty well narratively, especially the King of Puppets fight. On your first playthrough, while you can't understand what the King of Puppets is saying, you kinda get the vibe that something is going horribly wrong here. This is where the Nier comparison kicks in. I'm talking about the original Nier, of course, where you aren't initially aware of the war crimes you're committing. While this fight makes the twist regarding the nature of Ergo not so unpredictable, it was still a wonderful oh shit moment for me. Unfortunately, despite enjoying the game's bosses in general, there are some that don't really do it for me. Neither of the Black Rabbit Brotherhood fights are impossibly difficult by any means, but I sure didn't like them. The first encounter with them was the first boss in the game I didn't have fun with. Sure, the Fallen Archbishop kicked my ass, and there were aspects of that fight I didn't love, but overall I still enjoyed it. However, I just inherently dislike how the Black Rabbit Brotherhood encounters are designed. The first one definitely isn't as bad as the second. If you play the fight as intended, you only have to manage 2 enemies at once. It's also possible to win the first encounter by simply defeating the Eldest, which makes some cheese strats pretty viable. But then there's a second encounter. You're not getting out of this one unless you kill every single one of them in cold blood. To make matters worse, you're forced to face 3 of them at the same time. It's one thing to recycle a boss that wasn't particularly fun to begin with, but wow, then there's somehow making that fight even worse. After you put down 2, the Eldest will make his return with some new tricks up his sleeve. Again, I don't think this is the hardest boss in the game, but damn, is it irritating as hell. Unfortunately, after this fight, Lies of P still has one giant stinker up its sleeve. Simon Manus is a good fight, in a dimension that's parallel to the one we currently reside in. The sad truth of the matter is that the Simon Manus of this universe is a poopy face, and I hope he trips on a Lego brick. Frickin' hecker. His first phase is pretty slow and is fairly easy to beat. Upon several repeated attempts, this aspect of the fight started to feel no different than having to deal with an unskippable cutscene. Then you have to deal with the Balteus at home phase of the fight. Don't be fooled by his lame looks, as he will absolutely slaughter you. The difference in difficulty between these 2 phases makes this fight a lot worse than it needs to be. The first phase doesn't present anything interesting enough to be very enjoyable on repeated attempts, and just makes the fight a slog. The second phase is extremely aggressive and can move across the arena very quickly. It's a pain in the ass to learn the openings because you can die very quickly, and then you have to drag yourself through the beginning of the fight again. Simon Manus would be a much better boss if, well, he had a better design, because look at him. He's one of the stupidest looking things in the game. However, another way to majorly improve this fight would be to simply give him a single health bar that's a middle ground in terms of difficulty between the 2 phases found in the final game. I don't think it would hurt if Lies of P lost at least 1 boss encounter with 2 health bar phases. Fortunately, the game doesn't have to end with this fight. Lies of P has one last challenge for the player to overcome. The Nameless Puppet may be another fight with 2 health bars, but they decide to make this one fun. It's anime as hell without going too off the rails with it. This encounter has some of the best boss animations in the game, and even the delayed animations are a lot more clear on when you're supposed to react. This is where the game's difficulty is at its best. The Nameless Puppet is tough as hell, but a great way to end the game. At first I thought that Laxasia would make for the best final boss, and not because of the I can fix her phase of the fight. However, I'm pretty satisfied that the game ends with the Nameless Puppet. Overall, I quite like the story. While it still has the minimalist presentation that you would expect from a Souls game, it's not too difficult to understand. I like that P himself starts to exhibit more human traits as you progress throughout the game. It's subtle details like that which make the game special in that regard. I'm not going to do a big breakdown analysis of the story here, but I didn't expect to be as invested in it as I was. There's some pretty solid world building and characters here. If you want me to do an analysis of the story in the future, please let me know and I'll consider it. Anyway, Lies of P is a fantastic first attempt at a Souls-like from a Korean developer I know very little about. It's not every day you can say that a random studio releases a game that rises above most in its subgenre. However, this game does just that. Lies of P is quite likely the best non-From Software Souls-like I've played. There's a level of polish here that most studios can only dream of achieving. That's not to say that the game is perfect by any means. I'd like to see some level design in the future that's at least a bit more complex than what it's found here. The art direction of the environments themselves is fantastic, but I think exploration is something the studio could work on improving. Additionally, I'd like to see some changes made to how enemy animations are designed. Thankfully, the game's combat mechanics somewhat make up for this flaw, but this is still a significant problem with the game. While a certain amount of delayed attacks are fine, the game relies too heavily on them. If it weren't for the variety of options the player has access to, this would be a much greater issue. A little pet peeve I forgot to mention is the need to travel to the hub area to visit the obligatory level up waifu and blacksmith waifu. Fortunately, I like Hotel Krat enough as a location that it doesn't end up bothering me too much. It always feels comfortable to return here, and it's quite gorgeous to look at. So, this is probably one of the best implementations of a hub area that I've seen in a Souls-like. Besides all that, I can safely say that Lies of P was the biggest pleasant surprise of 2023. I didn't think this game was going to be awful by any means, but I didn't expect it to grip me as much as it did. This is an easy recommendation for anyone who likes Souls games, which is a lot of people, now that I think of it. It's not a masterpiece, as that's a term I don't use lightly at all, but damn am I looking forward to what this developer has in store next. This is up there with Armored Core 6 as one of my favorite games of the year. If you haven't played it already, just go ahead and do it. It's great. And that concludes this review. If you like what you saw, please subscribe and hit the bell icon. I'm trying to improve my workflow so I can put content out more frequently and with a higher quality than before. I appreciate you watching all the way to the end, except if you randomly decided to skip here for some reason. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.